Thank you for joining us today. My name is Bill Baker. I'm with Firestorm, and we'd like to welcome you to this webinar. This is a part of the RenWeb Crisis Coach series. This is the 9th in the series. Today we're going to be discussing active shooter and armed intruder. Firestorm is on Facebook. We invite you to become our Facebook friend at Firestorm Solutions. You can also follow us on Twitter, Firestorm Soul. And yes, there is a hashtag for this session, and it's Crisis Coach. Firestorm transforms crisis into value and empowers you to manage risk and crises. Firestorm has extensive expertise in crisis management, critical decision support, crisis communication, crisis public relations, and consequence management. Our attorneys would like us to be sure to present this disclaimer. The presentation today is not complete without accompanying oral comments and discussion, and the work product that we're providing must be read and considered in conjunction with your organization's personal counsel. In addition, the information given and comments made should not be interpreted as legal advice or a legal opinion. As I mentioned, this is part of the RenWeb Firestorm Crisis Coach webinar series. Today we're going to be discussing active shooter, armed intruder. Our speakers today, and we're fortunate to have two speakers. We've got Jim Satterfield, who is the president of Firestorm, and we also have the chairman of Firestorm, Harry Rulin. Both of them have extensive experience in armed shooter and armed intruder situations and are very experienced in the school market especially. Crisis Coach webinar series is presented and underwritten by RenWeb. Our good friends at RenWeb are sponsoring this for their members and prospective clients so that they might be able to have these opportunities. Our moderator today, Jacqueline, has not logged on, so Jim, Jim Satterfield, could you make some comments about our friends at RenWeb?
Normally Jacqueline would be speaking at this point, but she may have had a log-on issue today as they're helping the schools. And the relationship, as Bill described, between Firestorm and RenWeb goes back to well over a year ago. And this webinar series, if this is the first that you've attended, you can go to the Firestorm website and look at the previous webinars as we've been focused on these subjects. For those of you that are on the RenWeb system, you already know all the values that it brings to you and the features that certainly help you in running your operations and are certainly going to be an advantage to you if you find yourself in a disaster or an emergency situation. The user group meeting is coming up in Atlanta the week after the 4th of July. And so if you have not attended the RenWeb User Group Conference, it's a great opportunity to network with your peers from other schools, learn more about how the software works and additional applications. And we're going to be doing a special track this year at the conference around crisis management. We'll let you experience making decisions in a crisis and have a better understanding of it. So if you haven't attended or if you have in the past, this is a great opportunity to continue your education in terms of what you have to do in a crisis to deal with these types of matters. On the call today is Harry Rulin. Harry and I have known each other for a long time, and Harry and I are co-founders of Firestorm, and he comes to us with a background in the insurance industry and the legal perspective, and Harry's been eminently involved in many of the active shooter and armed intruder events that have occurred in our schools, and we'll share some of those insights today as we go along. My name is Jim Satterfield, and that's what we're about to talk about today. As we start each of these webinars, we talk about what's been in the news and what's been occurring, and clearly all of us have seen the events of the last several weeks, and it makes our topic today even more timely as they've been occurring. We saw just recently the shootings in Oregon, and the student who brought the rifle to school killed another. And you find an interesting aspect associated with it in the evacuation. As the police were doing pat-downs of the students who were evacuating, 2 additional students had guns. Those students were not related to the attack, were not involved with the attack, but that meant that those 2 students had a gun at school and had it successfully inside of it. So we never know how many are going to be there at any given time, and today we're going to talk about how we can prevent the guns from coming to school and those types of aspects. We've seen the shootings that occurred just recently in Las Vegas with the assassination of the 2 policemen, moving through and killing a citizen at the Walmart, and then ultimately there. We saw the shootings the week before up in Seattle at the Christian Liberal Arts College there, where that was thwarted in process by a student who used pepper spray to stop that particular event. We had the Santa Barbara shootings that have occurred. Unfortunately, we see this pattern reinforcing. Over the last 18 months, we've had 44 shootings in schools throughout the country. The Minnesota story was about a month ago, where an individual saw a teenager at a storage facility putting things in, and this triggered potentially a concern. She notified the police, and then in research they found that he had built a series of pipe bombs, had multiple weapons and ammunition, and his strategy had been to create a fire diversion to bring the fire and police to a particular location, then to attack his school and to go down in a blaze of glory. That was thwarted because someone saw something and someone said something, and that's a theme that we're going to come back with. Earlier in May, we saw the shootings at the FedEx here in Atlanta, and one of the common themes there was people thought it was a joke, thought that this person wasn't serious, and this is a former employee coming in and doing it, and it is never really a joke. Over 60 times a day in tweets across the country, the term school and gun are used in the same tweet. These are issues that we want to focus on in terms of what you're doing from an intelligence standpoint to monitor social media. And behavioral threat risk assessment is the one thing that all of these have in common. All of these events that we see could have been potentially prevented had a behavioral threat risk assessment had occurred. So at our schools, we see a great many threats behind our students, and they're facing those every day. We've given a lot of statistics around this area in earlier webinars as we've gone through, and we've talked about the fact that there are over 2.1 million episodes of bullying annually in our schools. There are over 2 million episodes of workplace violence annually in the United States. And remember, our school is a workplace as those areas come together. So we really want to try to simplify this area of school preparedness. And thank you for listening today, and thank you for participating, and thank you for everything you're doing every day to help educate our young people and to keep them safe. We recommend following a predict, plan, perform process. Predicting and understanding what the vulnerabilities and threats are, what are their impacts, how do you monitor, and what are the triggers. And that's extremely true when we think about the behavioral threats that are associated here. The statistics that you will hear cited repeatedly that over 80% of the time, someone else in the school knew that there was a threat that was highly likely. They either overheard something or saw something. They gained some level of knowledge. 80% of the time. 67% of the time, 2 people within your school did. And we'll show you a story off social media toward the end today that will drive this home even more. The term is leakage. You need to make it easy for your students to share what they see so that you can carry forward. You certainly are going to need plans, and we're going to share a lot of detail around what those plans are today and give you some ideas around those areas. And then under the form, they have to be tested. You have to train your people. You have to be empowered to be able to handle those individual areas. So that's what this RenWeb Firestorm webinar series is about. Taking a look at all of the plans, and that's not active shooter, but everything that could happen so that you're prepared as strongly as you are academically, that you're prepared to handle your operations. Now, almost every episode in this area are preceded by warning signs. So if we could stop that gun from coming to school, then we've eliminated an area within that. And there was a book written a number of years ago by two Harvard professors called Predictable Surprises. And in each of these areas, you're going to find that they're highly predictable in that perspective. You know, Firestorm utilizes a great many retired Secret Service agents. And they bring a unique perspective in the education and training, and quite frankly, they see and identify risks and threats that others would miss. But one common theme that they talk about on a regular basis is that when seconds really matter, the police will be there in minutes. The reason why you need to have a plan, the reason why you need to train your people is that plan becomes your time machine. That plan buys you the time that you need until help can arrive. And so when we talk about standards and best practices, locking classrooms while classes are in session, that's to buy you the additional time if one of these tragic events occurs, so that you have that luxury of being able to have the police intervention before it becomes too late, so that you can respond effectively. Plans are time machines. They buy you the time when you need it the most in each of those areas. So looking at students that are at risk, or staff members. We're seeing domestic abuse come into the workplace on a regular basis. That's true equally within our schools as it is within any business area. If we can stop before that gun gets into the backpack, instead of having to deal with it afterwards, we're in a significantly stronger position. So think about the Oregon story that we shared at the beginning of this. You had an attacker in the school. He brought a gun to school. He shot and killed another student. He injured a teacher. He shot a teacher who will survive as a result of it. But there were two other students in that school with a gun. And the statistics are that there were other students in that school that knew that those other two also had guns. So your school needs to have anonymous reporting. You need to have those abilities in place so that that information can come to you to help deal with that gun before it's used at a point with ill intent. So how is this done? You have to have an established plan. You've got to have a framework. You've got to have policies and procedures. Now, the key here is a policy tells you what to do. A procedure tells you how to do it. So your plans have to be actionable, and they have to have specific details associated with it. So we're going to talk about that in the standard protocol that's in place to be able to deal with each of these areas. Harry, before I go on and get into the I love you guys, is there any observation that you want to make about the events that you've responded to over the last 6 months?
Well, it's interesting, Jim. I have been integrally involved in a couple of these shootings, one that took place late last year, the one in Arapahoe High School at Littleton Public Schools in Colorado, and then another one that was in Roswell, New Mexico. And one of the things that you pointed out that I think is essential for everybody to understand is that the goal, while we all have to have very high quality emergency response plans, crisis management, and crisis communications plans for when an event does occur, our goal is to prevent it from ever occurring. That behavioral risk and threat assessment process that Jim referred to is essential for every school, because you need to know how you're going to deal with any issue or threat that's made, any child that's acting out, any writing that a teacher sees that raises some issue of concern. So one of the problems that a lot of schools have is they want to know the answer to the question, how do they distinguish between ordinary behavior, ordinary teenage behavior, and something that's really a behavior of concern? And I think the only way that that happens is by having a behavioral risk and threat assessment process in place, having a threat assessment team that's been well trained, who can review the words or the writings and who know exactly what the protocol is for dealing with each of those situations. Every school must have a threat assessment team, and they must have a behavioral risk and threat assessment process in place. Otherwise, these are the kind of things that will slip through the cracks and unfortunately will then necessitate the implementation of those emergency response procedures. And keep in mind, it doesn't have to just be an active shooter. You know, violence shows itself in a lot of ways, whether it be through bullying. We also saw a situation, as you'll all recall, in Pennsylvania this year, where there was a series of stabbings. So being able to recognize those kids that need help and get them that help that they need before they act out is really the essential part of this overall program. So Jim, I think that, you know, that's something that I've been working on along with you and Susie for the last several months. Firestorm has put together a fairly robust process, and I would love to talk that through with any of the schools who'd like to augment or update their existing process, or even have us look at their existing process from a gap analysis standpoint to determine are there things that they could be doing differently or doing better. So I think there's always an opportunity to improve. I think any of the schools, you know, in that spirit of continuous improvement that would like us to participate with them in that process, I would really be very happy to speak with them.
And we're going to follow up what Harry just said at the RenWeb conference in Atlanta after the 4th of July. We're going to cover behavioral threat assessment and give you lift the covers a little bit and let you look underneath them to see what's involved. And then we're going to be doing an actual crisis exercise on how to deal with that. So we find that when confronted with a threatening situation, your students, your faculty, your staff, they don't want to be sitting ducks. They want to have information, that key phrase there, that's actionable. They need to know what to do and when to do it. And we can trust that they'll make the right decision if they have that information. They'll take the action that you need them to do and to carry forward. A few weeks ago, we did a presentation on anticipating human behavior in a disaster or a crisis. A crisis is not business as usual, it's business as unusual. And when people are put under stress and pressure, they will react differently. And the more that you can understand that, the better that you would be. Yeah, I love you guys out of Colorado. Created a standard response protocols. If your school is not using lockout, lockdown, evacuate, shelter in place, you should strongly consider doing it, because these represent the standards and best practices today. So that we're not worrying about there's a code orange or using your school mascot as a name. You want to have very clear instructions so that everyone needs to understand what you're going to do at each step along the way. And how you communicate those elements equally needs to be very clear. And if you haven't gone to the I Love You Guys website, I would encourage you to do that. You'll find a lot of great information there. And again, this is the protocols that you want to have clearly done. And we'll talk about when you do each one of those 4 actions in just a moment. Here's an example of having consistency in your messaging. In an emergency, say it twice, say it twice. If you have the ability to page across your campus, if you have the ability to communicate, you want to have it really clear what you're sending. Now, your messages will vary because your schools are different, the threats that you see are different, but you can see that these messages are simply easily done. Look at the last line where there's a weapon. Lockdown. Locks, lights, out of sight. That's a very clear series of actions. You want to maintain that those classroom doors are locked. You want the lights off associated with it. And if there's any visible lines, that you move the students and the teacher out of the line of sight there. Again, we're trying to keep the armed intruder at bay and away from your students as you go forward. You need to document the procedures, and your procedures will be different than this group, but it's an example now when you talk about an armed intruder protocol. You'll see here you're telling people not only what to do, but how to do it and the roles that they would perform. that middle of the way down, it says, I'll call 911. We want everyone calling 911 to get that call and that message in, sounding the alarm, or whatever your signal is, or whatever phrase that you're pushing out. Indicate where the armed intruder is, what the staff needs to do at that point in time. This is not a time for subtlety. It's a time for action, and action immediately to respond in each of these areas. Now, these are the three potential scenarios when you think about an active shooter or an armed intruder. The armed intruder could be outside of your building, and you could have staff and students outside. Well, what is it that you want your people to do in that area? And we recommend that you move the students away from the building, away from the hostile threat at that area, following a lifeboat strategy. The teacher is the lifeboat, the students rally to the teacher, and the teacher moves them away from the threat, away from the school. In the meantime, the school would be on a lockout because the armed intruder is outside of the building associated with it. By the way, this would be identical to the strategy that Disney uses in the theme parks. When there is a problem there, their staff, their ambassadors, move the guest away from where the problem is. I would also strongly encourage you to run a test exercise with the intruder outside and your students outside. All of you have practiced a situation where you have gone on lockdown, which would be the second, with the armed intruder inside the building and the students and staff inside. That is a lockdown. You're locking those areas down. And once again, the standards and best practices are today that all classrooms should lock from the inside and should remain locked during the class session so that you don't have to go and lock them. They already are, in fact, locked. The last one is the intruder is outside and the staff and students are inside. Clearly our goal here, there's a threat in the area. You receive word of it. You understand it. Someone sees something. And at this point, you have locked all the outside doors, and the students and staff are inside. In every one of these events, we're going to be reaching out to the police and carrying them forward with those areas. So the response protocols around active shooter, armed intruder are very straightforward. They need to be clear, you need to train, you need to exercise, you need to establish your communications, but this is not a complicated process. What's complicated is the area that Harry talked about a few minutes ago, and that was understanding the behavioral threat risk. Now, the statistic that you see up here that the students that felt bullied or persecuted, and that's a commonality associated with it. And many times you see this person who has responded because they felt there was no other action in taking a violent step. By the way, the statistics are also interesting that the majority of the time, over 2/3 of the time, the person that becomes the shooter had not been a problem prior to this. So it was not the bully that continually had done it. It was someone that was perceived as a good kid up to that point in time. The shooter that one of the schools that we were involved with had been on the debate team. Well, think about in your school the types of students that are on the debate team. That's not the standard protocol, the prototype that would have come immediately to your mind in thinking in those areas. So as we think about a behavioral threat assessment, here are the elements that go into that. You need to establish a team. You need to train the team. Everything that Harry had discussed earlier, very clear roles and responsibilities. There are protocols about how you do the investigation. You get the initial assessment that comes in to say this person is a potential risk or is not within those areas. How would we deal with those elements associated with it? And if that triggers, then you would move to a higher and more detailed assessment. And you may go to a higher level yet where you bring in an outside expert, a forensic psychologist, because we want to deal with this when it's a behavior of concern before it becomes threatening, violent, or even ends in death. There are 4 stages as that develops, and we want to have you intervene at that lowest level. Additionally, you would have your internal resources together and backups because not everyone is at the school each day, the external resources that you would be involved with, the training, the monitoring of behavior. Anonymous reporting is required in all of these areas. Because the fact that there's leakage, because that other students know, you want to have them feel safe to come forward and share that information so that you can take those actions. And the last one there, case management. If you saw a student who was deemed to be a threat to themselves or others, a suicide threat or a threat to others in the 9th grade, you would follow that student from the 9th, the 10th, the 11th, and the 12th grade, all the way through that process. So here, as we think about this type of behavioral threat assessment and those particular types of threats going from direct to indirect, veiled, conditional, if you see a direct threat against a particular person and it's clear and it's plausible, that threat needs to be taken extremely seriously because that's not something that will just go away if left unattended. But even the earlier veiled threats and conditional threats are warning signs that we need to do an intervention. We need to be evaluating and doing an assessment associated with that. Or you want to talk any more about these types of threats or the program around the behavioral threat assessment?
Sure, I'd be happy to. I think one of the things that will become apparent to the folks who start putting together or have put together their behavioral risk and threat assessment process is that there are stages. And following the typical stages that Firestorm does in analyzing any risk or vulnerability, you know, we have an initial onset phase. So there's a phase where you first become aware of a behavior. So it's either observation by a student, a faculty member, a staff member. Sometimes it's a parent who express a concern about a behavior. It may be a writing, it could be bullying, it could be a rumor of abuse. Sometimes it's a social media event. It could be almost anything that creates that initial awareness. It is then essential as part of your process that there be a reporting tool, that everyone understand how they can report those behaviors of concern via text message, email, reporting in person, actually going up to someone and saying, hey, I heard Johnny say he was going to kill himself. You know, being able to report those things by phone. Some schools are using a suggestion box type of approach. I mean, there's lots of ways that it can be done. But then it's essential that that information get into some type of a central repository. Because one of the things that we've seen with some of the recent shootings that have occurred is that there were various people that knew different segments of the situation. Their own individual piece didn't seem that important. But when you aggregated them all together, you were like, wow, we should have seen this. So as part of your what we call BERTHA process, behavioral risk and threat assessment, as part of your BERTHA process, you've got to develop a central repository where all behaviors are reported and gathered together by name of student. So all of a sudden, there's 5 different reports about Johnny. Any individual one didn't trigger something, but all together we say, hey, wait a minute, we need to look at this. That's another thing that has to happen. You know, I talked earlier about your threat assessment team. You've got to have a team that meets regularly, probably once a week, to review all of the things that have come into your central repository. And that's if nothing of a serious nature has occurred. Because as part of that overall threat assessment team process, you'll also have triggering events where any team member can pull the team together on a moment's notice. So if there's a direct threat that's made, the threat assessment team members can either convene immediately the team or dial 911 because there's no time to convene the team. So it's essential that that team be very well trained, have very regular meetings, be analyzing the information that comes into the central repository, and once they do review those things that came in, they've got to decide, is an investigation necessary? So if the threat assessment team determines that a particular individual or a particular behavior needs to be investigated, they start the impact assessment phase. They go through a screening process. If they believe that a child really needs to be monitored or looked at or intervened, they can create an intervention plan. They can have a case management process. And as Jim indicated, there's then post-monitoring that goes on for the remainder of their school career. So all of that has to be integrated into your plan, and it becomes a very fluid and easy process to follow once everybody understands what their roles are. But, you know, even with the different types of threats, whether they be direct or indirect, you're going to have a low, a medium, and a high type of alert situation depending on who the individual is. You know, an indirect threat made by someone who's never been involved in any kind of a situation, and as Jim indicated, about 2/3 of perpetrators have never been involved in any kind of a situation. An indirect threat may not trigger a lot of alarm bells, but again, that is not for a teacher or a student or anyone else to make that decision. Your threat assessment team needs that information, and they need to be the ones to determine what action is to be taken. Because if I, as a teacher, you know, hear a frustrated kid say, "Oh, I'm going to kill someone," well, you know, we all say those kind of things once in a while, but that type of behavior needs to be reported, because if it's part of an overall string of issues that an individual is having, it may take on more meaning. So again, having that central repository is extremely important, and having a threat assessment team that's reviewing everything that's in the repository is extremely important. So it's not for any one individual within your school, whether it's a teacher or staff member, a member of senior management, to determine whether a behavior, a writing, or anything else should be dismissed. So again, that BERTHA process needs to be in place. The people need to be trained. There needs to be exercises on a regular basis, because that's the only way we're going to avoid that gun coming to school. And I'm sorry for being so passionate about this, but it really is something that I truly believe in, and I think can avoid a lot of problems for the schools that we work with.
Firestorm has unfortunately been called in after the gun has been used at a school. We know that environment. Our goal is to help you not to know that environment, to help you to intervene before it gets to that point where a student feels that they have no option but to bring that gun to use it. We're in a different world than we all grew up in. The frequency of these number of shootings continues to escalate. It's about looking at a behavior. It's about anticipating what's going to occur and intervening before that happens. If you say, "Gee, I don't know if we have a behavioral threat assessment," then you don't. If you don't, because this is the type of thing, you know the details of it, have trained your people, and practice this every week, as Henry pointed out, or you don't have a program. And so when you think about it, your school is at risk, whether it's from your students or an outsider. Those types of threats will come together. Additionally, the world has changed. Social media risk is the fastest growing risk that companies and schools face today. The rate of change has just been absolutely enormous. And if you think about a general in directing troops in battle, he'd like to know where the enemy is, what's their concentration, what type of weaponry do they have? Do they have tanks? And, are they on the move, and what's occurring? And so there's a lot of ways that in the Army that the general gets the information to make those types of decisions. In the world that we all live in today, social media is your own intelligence network. It's your own National Security Administration or your own school security administration. As you're thinking about what's going on, this term of leakage and comments occurs on a regular basis as we talk about it. And you'll see these are just some postings that our EVP for social media risk, Karen Mazzullo, found, and as she was looking at it, and you'll see the types of discussions from the cartoons and the statements. But if you'll look in the bottom right hand of your screen, you'll see a young man with a gun in a classroom environment and other students around. And then, and I apologize for the language that you see on the slides, but these were the postings from other students about it. And we monitor for schools and businesses, social media, to be able to talk about what's being said about them or what's occurring in their own individual areas. And when Karen saw the picture in the bottom right, it disturbed her, it bothered her. So she started to do more research. And remember, this term gun in school, we're talking about being mentioned over 60 times every single day. She did some research and she started tracking down in the tweets that were posted about it that there was a name of a teacher, and then later there was a name, a calculus. So she assumed that that must be a teacher for a math class. And by doing more research, she was able to determine that this was a school in North Carolina along the coast. It was a public school. And so she reached out to the principal of the school and said, I don't know if this is a hoax or real, but we thought you would want to know that this picture is being shared and these comments are being shared about your school. The principal thanked her and appreciated the information and looked and dealt appropriately with those that were involved. But he had an interesting comment. He said, the thing that troubles me most is all of the students, and there was a long, long list of students who were commenting on this, and not a single one of them had come forward to tell a teacher. Not a single one of them had shared with someone in the school that there was this posted and the comments were being dealt with. Now clearly, when this student had his picture taken with the gun, there was a student taking the picture. So multiple people had this knowledge and no one had come forward. And over the last 18 months, the school had been doing an aggressive program around see something, say something, and obviously they didn't. And that disappointed him the most in this area. We don't want to find your school because we see the report of the shooting that occurred today. We want you to be aware of what's being said within your school every single day. This is your intelligence network. This information is in the public domain. We're not talking about breaking into someone's private account. We're not talking about those types of things. Those are the areas that you need to look for. The way social media risk monitoring is done is you look at streams. Streams are made up of phrases. A stream is made up of 10 phrases, and each phrase can be made up of 3 words. And so looking and using your school name and what can be talking, what's being said about it. Is the term bomb? Is there a threat? What's the word you're looking to try to carry forward in getting this done? And this is not just doing a Google search. This is a separate area. So as we think about social media, clearly social media is involved in speaking when you're telling people what's going on in notifications. And the RenWeb software has that automatic notification ability to send messaging out, and that's an extremely important aspect of it. Social media is about listening. What's being said? What pictures are being shared? What's going on? That's the aspect that's missing that we find across all of the schools that we deal with, to hear about what's occurring. This is a way that you can learn that there's domestic abuse happening in a home. You can learn that there's substance abuse happening. You can learn that there's sexual abuse happening. So it's just not about a gun. It's about behavior in your school affecting your students every single day. So if you're thinking about monitoring, you would want to make sure that you're dealing with these areas, that the system would automatically send you alerts to say, did you know this was out there? Obviously, the principal at the school in North Carolina did not know that. You can measure the conversation. You can map that to see what the sentiment is. Is it positive? Is it negative? Do you have some type of a morale problem within your school? Is there an issue that's coming up that could create a problem associated with it? So looking at the string, looking at the phrases, looking at the words, monitoring that process empowers you to make the decisions in a timely manner instead of reacting to it at the moment that someone comes in with a gun. Do we want you to know what to do when the armed intruder is seen? Absolutely. But we'd like you to know what you need to do in the moments before that gun ever came to school to know that it's likely to occur. If you'd like an assessment of your plans through underwriting from RenWeb, a preparedness assessment can be done on your school. We look at 8 dimensions and 5 or 6 data points in each of those 8 dimensions and can tell you where you are relative to standards and best practices and benchmark your school relative to all the other private schools and independent schools across the country. And that's thanks to the underwriting by RenWeb. It's a great place to start. Or if you've got specific questions around behavioral threat risk assessments or learning more about social media monitoring, those would be things that we would certainly be glad to answer and talk with you today. It's obviously impossible in a 45-minute webinar to answer the questions from the couple of hundred people that attended today's webinar session. If you'd like to share this within your school, there's a link that you'll be able to go to and view the webinar again or to have others view it. And we'll try to reach out individually to every school on today's webinar to answer questions and get you copies of material in that process. So our thanks for all that you do each and every day. If you'd like to view any of these webinars, you can go to firestorm.com. If you've got questions, you can send us an email at webinars@firestorm.com, or you can call us at 800-321-2219. Firestorm is trying to help you transform crisis into value. Every crisis is a human crisis. That student is at risk. That student is a risk to themselves, and they're a risk to others. We want to transform that crisis into value for the student, their family, and all of your students. That's the issue that we're focused on today. Active shooter, armed intruder. School year is wrapping down. The Oregon school reminded us that even at the end of the school year, bad things can happen. The time now is to plan for the fall. Make sure your plans are being updated now, that as you train your faculty and your staff as they come back in August for the starting of school in September, that you have these areas in place. This is a commitment. It's a commitment from the head of school and your organization to your board of directors or trustees, to everyone there. We want your campus to be prepared now so that you won't be one of the statistics that comes through, that you won't be the school that they're talking about on television tomorrow. So there's a lot to learn, a lot to think about, and a lot to do. Just as you want academic excellence for your students, academic excellence for your school, and to talk about how many you graduate and how many get advanced placement and how many win scholarships. That's a great subject to talk about and to build and to carry forward. We want you to have the same level of excellence from a preparedness perspective as you do from an academic perspective. Harry said it earlier, it's all about continuous improvement. This is a journey, and it's something that you have to do every day as you have school and carry it forward. So Harry, any last comments before we close? We're just about a minute from wrap up.
No, other than, again, this is an area that Firestorm is putting a lot of effort into and a lot of work, and we would love to talk to any of the schools, administrators, any of the people who have concerns about this behavioral risk and threat assessment process. We'd love your input. We'd love to participate, so don't hesitate to call us.
And we're available to help you. Thank you for all you're doing for our young people across America today and in the fall.